All right, good morning. Man, so good to have Jim and Kayla here today. Y'all just did my heart good to see you, and then extra special to get to hear Jim lead our thoughts around the table today. So appreciate that very much. Sure admire you, who you are, and what you're doing in the kingdom of God very much. In the past few weeks with my daughter's injury, we've made a few trips back and forth to El Paso. I don't know if you've made that trip before. The route that we take a break. We go through Artesia, where my family's at. So then we take a road between Artesia and El Paso, and if you've ever driven that stretch, you'll know it's pretty desolate, and that's being kind. Our last trip through, I learned after the fact that my wife was counting houses during that stretch. You would be stunned how few houses there are over a period of a couple of hours. It's barely habitable. It is a rough stretch of road. And of course, I'm doing this study in Daniel, so I couldn't help but think about exile. And in the New Testament, it talks about exile. It compares it to things that we go through in life. So you might think of exile as really any stretch of life that is desolate. Any hardship in life that we face that's really long and difficult. It's not a place where you would think of as thriving or really being able to produce much fruit. And yet that's where we live a lot of our life, in a situation of exile. So I want to think about those desolate stretches of life today and just share with you some encouragement for that. I know some of you are in such a stretch. You're going through a really hard time right now. You've got a hardship in your life, or maybe it's a regret and you're feeling the sorrow of how you've lived or what you've done that's brought on some hardship. Or maybe it's just spiritual dryness. It's not related to anything happening in your life, but you feel like, spiritually speaking, you're on that long, desolate stretch of highway. So Daniel chapter 9 is where we're going to be today. Gabriel and the 77. This is one of the most controversial texts in the Bible. That's what every preacher wants to see when he opens up the books, to get ready for the sermon. This is one of the most controversial texts in the Bible, and definitely the most difficult in this book. So that's what we're going to do this morning. Tonight, at 5 o'clock, we're going to talk about one of the most straightforward and uncontroversial texts in all the Bible. So I'm going to balance it out today. In this text, I hope you will hear it. Encouragement and hope for desolate seasons of life, desolate times, including spiritual dryness. What happens in this text is we get the curtain pulled back. We see the stretch of highway that we're on, but we're going to get the curtain pulled back, and we're going to see some realities that are true now and some realities that will be true that give us hope. So we're going to look at two parts, the visitor and the vision. We start with the visitor, Daniel chapter 9, verse 20. While I was speaking and praying, confessing my sin and the sin of my people Israel, and presenting my plea before the Lord my God for the holy hill of my God, while I was speaking in prayer, the man Gabriel, whom I had seen in the vision at the first, came to me in swift flight at the time of the evening sacrifice. Okay, so just to remind you the context here, this is Daniel's prayer. We looked at that last week, verses 1 through 19. He's been confessing sin, his sin, and the sin of the people, pleading for mercy on behalf of God's people, seeking restoration at the end, an end of exile. And it says here, you notice this detail in verse 21, at the time of the evening sacrifice, he's praying. This is a real interesting detail because he's in exile. He's a long way from Jerusalem. The temple has long since been destroyed. The time of evening sacrifices is a thing of the past. It's not been happening for some time, and yet he's still on Jerusalem time. I love that. You got a guy in exile. He's been there for about 7 decades, and he's still on Jerusalem time. He's still keeping time with the pattern of God's people. Prayer is routine. We've already seen that in the book for Daniel. Prayer is a routine part of his life. I suspect it was normally uneventful. This time it wasn't, but I suspect it's normally uneventful. It's a routine part of his life. And then he has this interruption. While he was speaking in prayer, says the man Gabriel came to him. Verse 21, the man Gabriel. We've encountered him before. Chapter 8, verse 15. He's one having the appearance of a man, although we know he's not a man. He's the one that explained the vision of the ram and the goat, if you remember that in chapter 8. This is an angel. Luke chapter 1, we encounter him. He is a heavenly messenger. So he's not a man. He's one who has the appearance of a man. He's one of only 2 named angels in the Bible. And he came in swift flight. It's that word there, if I understand right, it's kind of ambiguous in Hebrew. It could be that it's talking about Daniel's extreme weariness. So if you've got a different translation, you might notice that Daniel's saying he came to me in my extreme weariness. It's because we're not really sure how to translate it. It could be that he came swiftly, or it could be that Daniel is extremely weary. Either way, you've got the appearance of one like a man who's not a man, who is a heavenly messenger. That is unusual. When we think about our world and what's normal and what's routine, some would say that's fantastical. That's unreal. I think it's important to recognize and really to think about this. I love the way Joshua, I have a hard time saying his name here, Chatreau, I think is how you say it, Joshua Chatreau. I love this illustration. He talks about how we live in a one-level world. We live in a disenchanted, one-story world today that denies the existence of the divine. He's talking about the way that our world thinks, the way we view reality. Earlier eras lived in a two-story world. They viewed one story, level 1, human life, present concerns, what we see with our eyes. And then there's a second level, a of higher significance and purpose and higher beings, two-story world. But in our world, society does not believe in that second story anymore. We've pushed that aside and just said it's just what you see with your eyes. It's just what you can measure that is real. Some have found this freeing. They think that it's liberating to say there is no divine, there is no God, there are no angels, there's just the material world. Some find it freeing. They can do whatever they want. Others find it deeply unsatisfying. There's something within us that says there's more. And I think that's really significant, that in the human spirit, there's something that says there's more than what I see. And so there's a great searching in the human heart for more, for what is transcendent. So you look at this text, and then you also just recognize what is in the human spirit, that we recognize there's more. I think this is an important thing to encourage us with today. The spiritual realm, you could say that second story, is unseen, but that doesn't make it unreal. We are seeing something. We get the curtain pulled back in this to see what reality is. There is divine. There is supernatural. There is this spiritual realm. It's real. It's just normally unseen. And actually, a lot of reality is that way. I was listening to a podcast this past week between an atheist science writer and a Christian academic. And it was interesting to me, one of the points that the atheist science writer made was really interesting. He was talking about how there's actually a lot in our physical world that is invisible to us. He talked about X-rays, which we didn't discover until not too long ago, cosmic rays, and then he talked about dark matter. I'm not going to chase all that down, but he was making the point, even as an atheist, that there is a whole lot of reality that we are not sensitive to. that is invisible to us. It is a matter of fact. There is invisible reality that you and I don't see. It is a part of our world. So it is not fantastical to say there is a spiritual realm, there are divine beings that we can't see unless it's unveiled to us. So there is this real but unseen world. This heavenly visitor comes to Daniel while he's praying. Verse 22. He made me understand, speaking with me and saying, O Daniel, I've now come out to you to give you insight and understanding. At the beginning of your pleas for mercy, a word went out, and I've come to tell it to you, for you are greatly loved. Therefore, consider the word and understand the vision. Okay, we're going to get to that. Before we consider that word and try to understand that vision, I want to note just a couple of encouraging things here. The first is this: God hears prayer. We see in this text that he's answering prayer, but it struck me how important it is to stress, to remind myself, to remind us as a church that God hears us when we pray. God hears the one who is in that desolate place. He hears, he listens. He hears the exiled one. He hears the one in misery. And I think sometimes we use the expression, we'll say, it feels like my prayers aren't getting past the ceiling, right? We live in a one-level world, and we say, yeah, my prayers, no one's hearing. Your prayers are heard. That is the truth the Bible tells us from beginning to end. Our God is a God who hears prayer. And just because the answer does not come when or how you think it should does not mean it's not heard. We serve an almighty, sovereign, all-wise God who we can trust, but he always hears us. Isaiah 65:24, God says, before they call, I will answer. He's a God who knows our needs before we even say them. While they are yet speaking, I will hear. God is a God who hears prayer. I was encouraged by this, just thinking about, I'm one of many in this room who have a kid at camp this week or on his way to camp this week. And it's awfully hard to be away from your kids when they're at camp. I'm just learning this, my second year at this. But I'm finding how important it is for my kids to have time where they are seeking their Father. And it's hard being away, but I was encouraged and comforted and thinking, man, my kids have a Father. And when they call out to him, he hears. Just want to encourage you today. You have a God who hears prayer, and he treasures prayers. This word that comes to Daniel is that he's greatly loved, or if you've got the NIV, it says that he's highly esteemed. More literally, it's saying you are very precious. This is very precious. The CSB says you're treasured by God. One scholar said it could be rendered, you are a treasure. God treasures our spiritual engagement with him. Now, this is kind of hard because sometimes we think, well, yeah, I mean, Daniel, he's a good guy. Of course, God loved and cherished and treasured him. We are all loved. We're going to talk about that more tonight. We are all loved. You are loved far more than, I'm fairly confident saying we are all loved way more than we comprehend. You're all loved. With our children, we know, we'd say we love our children unconditionally, right? Even when they misbehave. We love them mostly, I think we would say that. But isn't it also true that we treasure certain things they do? We always love them, even when they disobey. But there's certain things they do or the way they are that we treasure. Daniel is loved because he's a human being. But there's something about Daniel, and especially as he's coming in prayer and he's been confessing in this, as we looked at last week, and God says, you are treasured. I want to remind you, not only when you pray, whether you feel it or not, God hears you and he treasures what's happening. When you bring your heart, your needs, your anxieties, your hurts before him, that is something God in heaven treasures. It's encouraging to me. It's a glimpse of unseen reality that we get. There is a second story. There is a God. He hears when you pray. He treasures your prayers. Now, verse 23 says, therefore, consider the word and understand the vision. So let's talk about the vision a little bit. I'll remind you that this is the third of 4 visions that are in the second half of Daniel. The first half is story. Second half, primarily vision. This vision's a little bit different than the others. This one is one that comes in the form of what we might just say a message or a revelation. Let's look at it. Chapter 9, verse 24. 70 weeks are decreed about your people and your holy city to finish the transgression, to put an end to sin, and to atone for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal both vision and prophet, and to anoint a most holy place. Know, therefore, and understand that from the going out of the word to restore and build Jerusalem to the coming of an anointed one, a prince, there shall be 7 weeks. Then for 62 weeks it shall be built again with squares and a moat, but in a troubled time. And after the 62 weeks, an appointed one shall be cut off and shall have nothing. And the people of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. Its end shall come with a flood, and to the end there shall be war. Desolations are decreed. And he shall make a strong covenant with many for 1 week. And for half of the week he shall put an end to sacrifice and offering. And on the wing of abominations shall come one who makes desolate, until the decreed end is poured out on the desolator. Unfortunately, we're out of time. It's one of those passages that just raises all kinds of questions. So what's going on here? A couple of things to remember. The apocalyptic style of the second half of Daniel. We've got to keep that in mind, that there's a particular kind of literature, a particular kind of writing. And in this style of writing, numbers and time periods are not formulas, but symbols. You got to think symbolically, not formulaic. In other words, don't get out your calculators and your calendars. You got to read it with different eyes. You can't think so much literally and formulaically. You got to think more symbolically. So let's think about it for a minute. The first thing that we have here is a decree of 77s. Now, in the ESV, I read weeks. Your translation may say sevens. It might say weeks. It just means a period of 7. So that could be days. It could be weeks. It could be years. It's just a period of 7s. But of course, we know 7 is hugely symbolic, right? It's a symbol of completion or perfection. This is a decree of 70 periods of 7. It has this element of completion and perfection to it. 70 times 7. We could just put it this way, a long, complete, perfect time. I think when you read 77s or 70 weeks, it's less about what you would calculate, the number of days or marking your calendar, and more about saying a long, complete, and perfect time. Think about the way that Jesus talked about it. Matthew 18:22, when they're talking about forgiveness. How many times should we forgive? Jesus said, I do not say to you 7 times, but 77 times. Or, as some translate it, 70 times 7. Now, was he saying get out your calculator? No. He's saying, forgive long. Forgive completely. Don't count. Don't calculate. Go all the way with forgiveness. That's the nature of it. So when we read this 77s, I think it's a lot less to do with calculating and calendaring and more about saying a long, complete, and perfect time. A decree of 77s in this text means that God does indeed have a good future for his people. That's what Daniel is praying for. That's what he's been searching the scriptures of Jeremiah, looking for. When is God going to bring about this good future for his people? But 77s is saying that good future is still a ways off. Obviously, my illustrations are coming from road trips because I've been doing a lot of that. But if you're on the road, nowadays just about everybody uses a GPS. Even if we know where we're going, I like to put it on because you see the minutes, right? You see when you're going to arrive. And so you got the little countdown there. And I don't know, I hate it when you look at it and you've added minutes. Some of you are going, that's never happened to me. Minutes are always going down. That's another sermon. We'll talk about that another time. But you hate doing that. When you know the time you're going to arrive and then you look down and you find out it's later, man, that's discouraging, isn't it? My kids are letting me know we just added minutes on that stop. That's what's happening in this text. This text is saying, you're reading Jeremiah and saying 70 years exile is over. And Daniel has a sense of, okay, it's about time. And God's saying, well, yes, but let's talk about some extra minutes here. It's not going to be over the way you think it's going to be over. The full restoration of God's people is still a long ways off. Exile is coming to an end, but what you think it's going to look like, that's a ways down the road. So it's kind of a little bit discouraging, that decree of 77s. Second thing is we get a breakdown of 4 periods. The time to come, this future time, is divided into 4 parts with 4 corresponding leader-type figures in it. I'm going to try really hard not to get too bogged down in this. But what helped me is looking at this and you're going, 4 periods. Haven't we seen 4 before in the study of Daniel? Chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar's dream had this statue of 4 materials. And you remember that the 4 materials corresponded to future kingdoms. They corresponded to certain empires. And then chapter 7, you had Daniel's dream of those 4 beasts. And they corresponded to future kings and kingdoms. And now we have 4 periods of time with 4 corresponding leader types. It's not really different than what we've been reading before. It's like another way of saying the same thing. There's going to be some history that unfolds that doesn't look like what you think it should look like, but there's good news in it. Now, I'm going to tell you what I think, and I'm going to ask for some grace, because people for 2,000 years, longer than that, have been trying to figure out what this means. I'm not going to, for a minute, pretend like I've got it figured out. I'm going to tell you the way I understand it, where I'm at right now, from the study that I've done in preparation for this. Here's what I think those verses we just read are laying out in terms of the 4 periods of time. Period 1 is coming very quickly. It's a relatively short period of time. It's the first week of the 70 weeks. That figure, I believe, is the Persian king, Cyrus, although it's possibly one of the Jewish leaders leading the restoration. This first week is when Cyrus commissions Jewish return from exile and the rebuilding of the temple. So that's kind of this first week. There's a leader type in this Persian kingdom, and there's going to be the start of renewal and restoration for God's people. The second period is a really long one, 62 weeks. It's a troubling time. History tells us that was the truth. A lot of this was marked by the Greek Empire, the Greek influence. Very troubling time for God's people. Even though exile was over, even though rebuilding was happening and had happened, there's still a great deal of trouble. Trouble is not over. At the apex of that troubled time, there was a high priest named Onias III who is removed by Antiochus. You read in the text about the anointed one cut off. Some people read that positively and say that's a reference to Christ. They might be right. I read it that it's talking about ongoing desolations and bad things that are going to happen. I think this is talking about an evil or wicked occurrence that affects the anointed one of God's people, the high priest. Cuts him off. Period 3, this is when Antiochus IV slaughters Jews and desecrates the temple. We've already encountered him. He is the Seleucid king, predicted in other visions in this. He is, in the text we just read, the coming prince. He attacked Jerusalem. He slaughtered many. He looted and desecrated the temple, fulfilling the things that were said in what we just read. That would be a half week. In that last week of the 70 weeks, it'd be half of that period. And then fourth is Titus, Roman commander, later an emperor, who sacked Jerusalem and destroyed the temple in AD 70. And associating Titus with that figure that was in this text fits with Jesus' prediction and reference to Daniel in Mark chapter 13 when he talked about the abomination of desolation. If you remember our study of Mark, we talked about that. It links up with this. Okay, are y'all still with me? All right. There's a lot of this that I'm telling you, it's just my best way of understanding it. I think what he's saying is when you break down the time that's going to come, which is going to be long, there's going to be a lot in it that does not look good for God's people. There's a lot of hard stuff in there. But there's something, you might say this is the obscure, there's something obvious. We've talked about this. The key to apocalyptic literature is looking for the obvious, not the obscure. The key to understanding this is not getting that right. The key to it is really straightforward. It's really clear. So here's the way that I would put it. This is what I think is the obvious truth that's being said. There is a long and desolate stretch ahead. Daniel is saying, is it time for exile to be over? Because I'm reading Jeremiah, and it looks like it's time. 70 years is almost up. And God is saying there's a long and desolate stretch ahead. I'm sovereign. It's going to be complete and perfect in time. It's all in hand. But there's a long and desolate stretch ahead. Exile is over, but trouble is not. There will be future kings and kingdoms who will do their worst, and God's people will suffer. But that long and desolate stretch is not endless. That's the obvious truth that comes across in this passage. It's going to be hard, but it is not endless. This is ultimately a message of hope, and it's what I really hope we hear and take away today. I hope what you walk away with today is not, here's what these 4 periods are. I hope what you walk away with today is hope. I want to zero in on verse 24. Look at it again. In verse 24, there are 6 features of hope to come. God's saying, I've got the future in hand. And in this future, not only is there going to be kings and kingdoms who do their worst, there's going to be this reality, 6 features of hope. To finish transgression, I like the way the CSB puts it, to bring rebellion to an end. Isn't that good? To put a stop to sin. To atone for iniquity. You could say cover, wipe away. To make the one that's put out, that's in the wrong, to put them back right. To atone for iniquity, to make forgiveness possible. To bring in everlasting righteousness. Oh man, isn't that good? To bring in what is right forever. There's a lot wrong with our world, isn't there? Can you imagine that? Everything made right forever. To seal vision and prophet. I think this is in the sense of confirming and authenticating everything that has been foretold and promised. The fulfillment of it all. Making it all come true. And then this anointing of a most holy place. It's the allusion to high priestly service. You might think in a heavenly sanctuary. Now, you just hear all of that, and I'm gonna be a little bit bold. I don't usually ask for feedback or answers to questions, but I'm going to do it today. Who does that? Who does that? Who atones for sin? Who brings in everlasting right? Who puts a stop to sin? Jesus. Yeah, that's the right answer, isn't it? It's Jesus. It's the most obvious truth from our vantage point. What we can see is all of this is pointing forward to the person of Jesus. There's a later visit in history by Gabriel. Happens in Luke chapter 1. There's actually 2 visits. He visits 2. He appears to Zechariah, and he announces that he will have a son, John the Baptist, who will prepare the way for the Lord. And then the same angel that appeared to Daniel appears to a young woman named Mary and announces that she will give birth to Jesus, this promised one to come. I want to read part of that. Luke chapter 1, verse 30. And the angel, this is Gabriel, said to her, "Do not be afraid, Mary, for you have found favor with God. And behold, you will conceive in your womb and bear a son, and you shall call his name Jesus. He will be great and will be called the Son of the Most High. And the Lord God will give to him the throne of his father David, and he will reign over the house of Jacob forever." Catch this last part. "And of his kingdom there will be no end." Okay, this vision of the 77s is communicating the same things that the other visions did. You remember chapter 2, the statue with the 4 materials? It was shattered by that stone that became a mountain and filled the whole earth, and it endured forever. Chapter 7, the 4 beasts. Remember those terrifying beasts? And then there's this one like a son of man who was given dominion and a kingdom of people from every nation and language. He was given an everlasting dominion. It says his kingdom will not pass away and will not be destroyed. The vision is the same. It's saying there are going to be kings and kingdoms who do their worst, but it is not endless. But there is a king coming, and his reign will be endless, and it will be good. So you hang on to that truth. I want to leave you with a word from this king who is, he reigns, he's with us by his Spirit, he's seated at the right hand of God in heaven, and no matter what you see right now, you might see before you a long stretch of highway that looks like the road to El Paso, and you're going, there's nothing. I'm telling you, there's a second story. There is a king. Hear what he says, John 16:33. "In this world you will have trouble." Right? You will. Kings and kingdoms doing their worst. Long stretch of desolation. You'll have trouble, but take heart. I have overcome the world. You're in a desolate stretch right now? Hang on to that. Lean into that. Lean on the one who's present with you and trust in that perfect reality to come. Take heart. If you've got something weighing on you today, we need to come together and pray about that. God hears. We want to lift it up to him. If you're not a Christian and you've not been transferred by the blood of Christ into this everlasting kingdom, I want to invite you to do it now while we stand and sing.